Hello and welcome to the CEBRA Inflation Drivers and Dynamics webinar series. My name is Dominic Smith, and I'm one of the organizers of this series, along with Raphael Schunla. And without any further ado, let me pass the virtual floor over to Jane Ryngaert, Assistant Professor of Economics at the University of Notre Dame, who will be today's moderator.
Good morning. The topics of today's sessions are a new reason to hate grocery inflation, measuring and interpreting inflation heterogeneity, and intertemporal pass-through. Special thanks to the organizers, Raphael Schunle from Brandeis University and CEBRA, and Dominic Smith from the BLS. Just to give you a heads up to the format of the webinar, this is a 45-minute webinar, which will have two presentations, each with 15 minutes, and then 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A at the end of both presentations. We'll finish both presentations before we move on to questions. Attendees do not have the option to switch on their audio and video, but are invited to write comments or questions in the Q&A space. Attendees can, of course, post their questions during the presentation and do not have to wait until the end. I will then select questions to be answered in the Q&A portion of the webinar after the presentations. The webinar is live streamed via the CEBRA YouTube channel and also recorded and made available on the CEBRA website and the CEBRA YouTube channel after the events. Links to the papers will be available in the YouTube video descriptions if provided by the authors. And lastly, as a disclaimer, participation in the CEBRA webinar does not constitute or imply an endorsement, recommendation, or favoring endorsement of the views, opinions, products, or services of the Central Bank Research Association or any other participating institution, individual, or entity. All views expressed during a CEBRA or CEBRA co-hosted event are strictly those of the authors, discussants, and other participants, and not those of CEBRA, the co-sponsoring institutions, or any other participating institution. And without further ado, I will pass things off to our first speaker, Kelsey O'Flaherty, who is an economist at the Federal Reserve Board, and he will be presenting a new reason to hate grocery inflation, measuring and interpreting inflation heterogeneity.
Thank you much. Am I sharing? Do you all see the slides? Stop me if otherwise, but I'm excited to get this.
I don't think we see your slides yet.
Yep, not yet.
I'll try once more. Okay, hopefully now.
Yes.
Okay. I'm very excited to get this work in front of you. I need to start it by saying that it is not the opinion of the Board of Governors or the Federal Reserve System more broadly, and it also reflects no input from Nielsen IQ, whose data we'll be using. But in this paper, I document a few, I think, very important facts about price changes and inflation in 2022 that I'm excited to get in front of you. And I'm excited about it because it certainly motivated me to really update my thinking about inflation from one change of average prices, big P, to a collection of idiosyncratic price changes that affect households very differently. And so it updated me to think about inflation as a phenomenon really through the household's lens. And we won't discuss it today, but in the paper, I also build a model that I think takes these facts, ties them together, and moves towards thinking about and interpreting inflation in that way. So what I'd like to spend today's presentation doing is just anchor you briefly to the literature that I build on and to the Nielsen data set that I'm going to use to lay out really three facts before you. And time permitting, I will explain the details of how that model that I introduce ties those facts together and reveals this new lens on inflation and why this household perspective of inflation matters. So the argument that I'll be making, of course, is that aggregate inflation misses important aspects of how inflation differs across households. And we know a lot about that already, of course. There's a very large literature about how inflation varies by income group, inflation differs also by geography, by racial group, by age, and in particular, that literature has found that on average, year after year, some demographic groups experience inflation rates that are about 0.3 to a 0.5 percentage point higher than others, and those are very serious facts for us to be aware of when we translate, consumption to real consumption for these households. I'm going to plug in more closely to a literature that takes seriously also that inflation varies at the household level, not just by demographic groups. And I think the pioneer of that research is a paper by Kaplan and Schulhofer-Wohl, which told us that households pay very different prices for even for identical goods, and that manifests as an enormous spread of inflation across households. It's very much in that spirit that I'm going to be anchoring my work, but I'm going to focus less on the price channel than by arguing that households buy very different goods within a product category. So we should not think of households as buying coffee, but a particular variety of coffee. And when we take that level of detail, which is going to jump out of the facts that I'm about to present to you, you see that it is responsible for an enormous degree of heterogeneity that I argue it has a large welfare relevance that we need to be aware of. And obviously the facts also interact importantly with a lot of other literatures that we're just not going to have time to discuss today. The data that we're going to use to document these facts comes from Nielsen IQ, and it contains two very nice data sets, the retail scanner data and the consumer panel data, that I'm going to use to get an exhaustive look at how prices are changing across individual goods on the grocery aisle shelves using the retail scanner data. And in the household data, we can actually see how individual households are responding to those price changes and how they are manifesting in their household level inflation rates at a category level and overall. So it's really the ideal data set for this question. That data is divided into many product modules. So I've been using coffee, but they are about that granular. So coffee, frozen chicken, men's shaving cream, that level of modularity. And you can think of this as maybe one segment of a grocery aisle. In this figure, what I'm showing you is the first important fact, which is that within those grocery aisles, which I'm kind of ranking according to the interquartile range of individual goods price changes across these product categories. So within coffee, some varieties might have a price change of 2% between 2018 Q4 and 2019 Q4. Some varieties might have a price change of 5%. That's going to generate an interquartile range, say, of 3 percentage points in that category, which is going to place it, in this region of the figure. And I do that, again, for every product category to trace out this characterization of how dispersed price changes are across individual items within these categories in 2022. And I do this exercise again in subsequent years. And the first important fact that jumps off the page is that across all product modules, we saw uniformly a significant increase in how dispersed the price changes of individual goods became. So now, for particular varieties of coffee in 2022, we might have some varieties having a 5 percentage point change, some varieties having a 25 percentage point change. That is going to lead to this 15 percentage point interquartile range of individual price changes for a good that we generally, when we're computing inflation, abstract away from this item level detail and say coffee has a price change. So that's fact one, is that those individual price changes became much more dispersed in 2022. And that comes to us from the retail scanner data. Now I'm going to move to the consumer panel data and show you inflation rates and the distribution of inflation rates for 3 product categories in this chart: coffee, frozen chicken, and men's shaving cream. And say, how did household level inflation rates for those categories evolve in 2019 and in 2022, let's say? So that's what the box and whisker plots are capturing here. And I'm going to do so in two ways. The Laspers index is going to capture what happens to households conditional on the good that they bought in the initial period, right? So a household buys Pete's in the fourth quarter of 2021. Let's just say it has this 20+% price change. Another household buys Folgers and it has a 5% price change. That is going to somewhat mechanically generate increased dispersion in households' Laspers price indices for these categories. But the second important fact I document is that when we give households the opportunity to substitute away from those changes, my prior, when embarking on this project, was that we should see that dispersion create these substitution opportunities that households actually take advantage of. And if that happens, we should see their posh inflation rates, which use the good that they bought after the price change. It allows them to reoptimize. We still see these enormous disparities in households' category level inflation rates, driven by the price change dispersion that I documented in the previous slide. And the last major fact that I want to share with you today is that when we kind of look across all of the goods in a household's basket and compute a Tornquist inflation rate, so that's going to be the average of this Laspers and Posh, it's what we think is ideal for capturing households' substitution opportunities. When we do that, and when we take this item level approach to saying you don't just buy coffee, you buy either Pete's or Folgers coffee, you buy a particular barcode, the distribution of households' inflation rates over their entire grocery basket became much more widely dispersed in 2022. So we did not just see a translation of the 2019 distribution, which is quite wide, by the way. Note that you have an interquartile range in 2019 of almost 1.5 percentage points. So this latent inflation heterogeneity that this item level reality generates is quite large. But you can see that when aggregate inflation rose in 2022, it became extreme. Okay, and so you have some households in a period where average inflation in this category is maybe 11%, who have a 15% inflation rate or greater. Right? This is I found this to be a shocking fact, and I think again it's an important one for us all to be aware of, and raises questions about how we think about the way households experience inflation. So let me then take us towards telling you about the model that I present in the paper that moves us, I hope, in that direction. So what I do is I give households idiosyncratic preferences. So instead of having that CES consumer that seems to view coffee as coffee and be very happy to substitute across varieties, you're going to have some households with these idiosyncratic preference structure have strong commitments to particular items in their basket. And that just simply modifying the model from the aggregate consumer to an individual household in that way, I think, in a way that makes at least my economic reality connects more closely with my economic reality, actually connects these facts quite nicely. When those households encounter this growing price change dispersion, it propagates through to their individual inflation rates because of their exposure to this much more volatile set of price changes than we capture by treating coffee as one big aggregate good. And when you take this approach, and whether it happens because of preferences or for other reasons, the bottom line of this model is that when you look at a household's actual grocery basket and the actual way that its price changes over this period, what you're identifying is how much more that household is paying for that bundle of goods, and therefore for the for the utility that comes from it, whatever it may be, right? And so that perspective, I think, is a very natural one to take and a startling one, because it tells us that these facts have material welfare relevance. A household level grocery rate is capturing a budget shock. I document the properties of those shocks to find that if you had a bad inflation draw this period, it does not quickly mean revert. Your basket really is more expensive for a material length of time. Households actually do seem to respond in a way that is consistent with what this model predicts, which is to say they reduce real consumption when they're hit with such a shock. That's precisely the opposite of what I think the the typical prediction is, which is that households experience higher inflation, expect higher inflation, and in fact run out and buy more. But it is consistent with what households tell us they do when they're hit with high inflation, right? So I think that it's an important perspective shift. It certainly was for me, and I think it raises important questions for the literature more broadly that I hope many experience in this paper will help to develop in the years to come. So I think each of the facts themselves is quite surprising. The fact that these price changes became so much more dispersed in 2022 was really contrary to my priors, especially because we expect these goods to be so substitutable. The fact that it happened and that households still did not substitute in response is also a huge puzzle that warrants more investigation. And it also, I think, reveals to us important insights about households' perceptions about the costs of inflation and the reality that aggregate inflation might bring more disparate budget shocks to households, and we, policymakers should be aware of that. We as a profession should be aware of that, and especially if, as is being documented by emerging research, households are selectively attentive to extrapolating what happens in their grocery basket to beliefs about total inflation. They're asymmetrically attentive to getting a really bad inflation draw of my basket seems to have gone up by 16% rather than 10%. What do I make of that? And they might be less attentive to when they get the symmetrically advantageous draw to say, oh no, my basket only went up by 4%. So I'll end there and just say thank you for the attention, and I'm really looking forward to whatever discussion this generates.
Great, thank you very much, Kelsey. Next, we have Ivan Yotzov, who is a research economist at the Bank of England, and he will be presenting his paper entitled Intertemporal Pass-Through.
Can I check that everybody can hear me and see my slides?
Yes, it looks good.
Okay, great. Then I'll get going. Thank you very much for the invitation. My name is Ivan Yotzov, and I'm going to present this paper called Intertemporal Pass-Through. This is joint work with Michel Gassib and Boro and Kirtio. And I should say Boro and I work at the Bank of England, and therefore the usual disclaimer applies. Okay, so what is this paper about? This paper is about forward-looking pricing behavior. And that's really at the core of monetary economics. At the aggregate level, we have things like the Phillips curve, which relates, for example, inflation today to the expected future path of output deviations and output gaps. And at the firm level, the equivalent of this is the relationship between a firm's optimal reset price today to the path of expected future marginal costs. And what governs this relationship at the firm level is this parameter phi. And that's going to be the focus of the presentation today, which we call the microeconomic intertemporal pass-through, or IPT. So what we're going to do in this paper is we're going to ask how responsive are firm reset prices to expected future cost shocks? How does the IPT vary across firms? So what are the relevant dimensions of heterogeneity? And then finally, what are the implications for aggregate inflation dynamics? How are we going to do it? We're going to identify firm-level shocks to expected future marginal costs. And we're going to have two shocks here using some quasi-natural experiments. Firstly, the unexpected announcement in 2019 of a temporary import tariff regime in the case of a no-deal Brexit. And furthermore, the second one is an announcement in 2024 of an increase in employer payroll taxes that was announced. So both of these are in the UK. So with these shocks, we're going to estimate the IPT at the firm level using a large representative survey of UK firms, which is also going to allow us to study heterogeneities in the intertemporal pass-through across firms. And then finally, we're going to derive some aggregate implications of these micro-heterogeneities in intertemporal pass-through. What do we find? We have four main findings. The first two are on the data side. We find that the IPT increases in the average price duration and falls in the horizon of the shock. So firms with stickier prices on average have higher IPT, and firms that expect the shock to occur further out in the future have a lower IPT. At the same time, we find that this pass-through is nonlinear, and in particular, it increases less than proportionately with the size of the shock. Then we have a model which is able to match these empirical findings and has heterogeneity in both adjustment frequencies and perceived horizons of the shock. And what that model tells us is that, furthermore, the heterogeneity in adjustment frequencies and in the heterogeneity in the perceived horizons amplifies the forward-lookingness of aggregate price indices. So these heterogeneities are really important for aggregate inflation. There's a lot of related literature, which I'm going to skip just in the interest of time and go on to the next part, which is to describe the data, and in particular these shocks that we construct. So the first one is a firm level tariff news shock. So to give you a little bit more context, let me take you back to about 2019. There was a lot of uncertainty in the UK about the UK's future relationship with the EU, whether there was going to be a deal, what kind of deal that was going to be, and there was a genuine concern about the likelihood of a no-deal Brexit at the time. So kind of in response to this, the UK government announced in March of 2019 a temporary import tariff regime that would be enacted in the case of a no-deal Brexit. So if there was a no-deal outcome, rather than tariffs going up to the most favored nation tariff rates, they would only increase to some intermediate tariff regime. And this was a detailed product level tariff announcement. What we do is we take this announcement and we construct a firm level shock that combines the sectoral effective tariff change based on this announcement with firm level data on the perceived probability of a no-deal Brexit and firm level data on the import cost shares from the EU. So for firm I and sector K, our tariff news shock is a combination of this sectoral announcement, the probability of a no-deal Brexit, and the import cost share at the firm level. And this is what it looks like across sectors. So as you see, it's quite heterogeneous. In some sectors, like preserved meats and meat products, bakery and other products, it's quite large. But there's also other sectors for which had a much smaller news shock. Now, one thing you're asking yourself is, why is it negative? I thought tariffs are going up. They are going up. But the key thing is that the announcement is that they would go up by less than you were previously expecting. So even though they're going up by less than previously expected. And so the news component here is negative. Okay. The second shock that we construct is a firm level payroll tax news shock. So over here, the idea is that in the 2024 autumn budget, the UK government announced an unexpected increase in the employer national insurance contributions firms are paying. And this policy change had three elements: an increase in the main rate, a reduction in the threshold at which employers start to pay, and an increase in an offsetting allowance. The key thing is that it's a very heterogeneous effect on wage costs for firms across the wage distribution. For lower paying firms had a much larger increase in their wage costs than high paying firms on average. So what we do is, again, for firm I in sector K, and in some percentile of the average wage distribution, we combine this NICS increase, which we have for different percentiles, with the firm's labor cost share to estimate the shock. And this is what the distribution of that shock looks like across firms. As you see, again, very heterogeneous. A lot of firms had a relatively small shock. but there were some firms that experienced a pretty large shock to their costs following this announcement. So we have the shocks. How do we actually estimate their impacts? To do that, we use data from the Decision Maker Panel, which is a large economy-wide business survey. It's been running for about 10 years now, and it has a lot of useful information. Crucially, data on firm output price growth, as well as a number of additional variables that help us estimate heterogeneities in pass-through across different firms and across different sectors. And then the final thing on the data side is we have sectoral and firm level estimates of price duration. This is one of the key dimensions of heterogeneity. So we use CPI and PPI microdata to estimate sectoral frequencies of price adjustment. And we also have firm level responses on average frequency of price changes in 2019 and 2024. Okay. Enough of the data, now on to the methodology. How do we estimate it? So our empirical specification is the following. We have a fairly straightforward regression, which we estimate at the firm level using data from the Decision Maker Panel. On the left-hand side, we have the cumulative non-zero log change in the price level between the quarter prior to the shock and the quarters after the shock. That's on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, we have our main treatment, which is either the tariff news shock or the payroll tax shock, and we test for heterogeneities in pass-through of the shocks to prices, and then we have a bunch of firm controls and also fixed effects as well. Going on to the results. Result 1, we find that the IPT, the intertemporal pass-through, increases in average price duration and it decreases in the expected Brexit horizon. So if we look at this table and we look at column 5, what this is estimating is the impact of the tariff news shock on the price change relative to the quarter previous to the shock. And what you see is that as you vary the price duration of firms that have higher price duration or they have kind of stickier prices, they have much stronger and more significant pass-through of the shock to their prices. Firms with kind of the highest level of price duration of 20 or more months, they have a pass-through of above 60%. Whereas for firms with kind of more flexible prices, pass-through is not statistically different from zero. At the same time, we have data on when firms expected Brexit to happen. And we split firms into two categories, those that expected it to happen in 2019 and those that expected it to happen in 2020. And we find that firms that expected Brexit to occur in 2020, i.e. the shock to occur later, they have a much lower IPT, a much lower pass-through to their prices. So that's the first result. The second result is that it's nonlinear. So we find that IPT is concave in the size of the shock. So as the shock goes larger, the IPT increases, but less than proportionately. And that's shown in this figure. So now let me just take a brief second and give maybe some intuition on this result. So I think it's fairly well established by now that for contemporaneous shocks, pass-through is increasing in the size of the shock. So you have a big shock, more firms choose to change their prices, therefore pass-through is higher. But what we find is that for expected cost shocks, the intuition kind of reverses. And the idea here is that if you know you're going to have a huge shock maybe a year from now, then you're going to update your probability of adjusting prices when the shock occurs, and therefore the IPT, which is by how much you adjust today, goes down. So in the limit, if you have a huge shock a year from now, then you're going to kind of know that you adjust when that shock hits, and therefore the IPT is going to be zero. And then the final result is on the payroll tax shocks, where we find that IPT is also lower for firms that change prices more frequently, and it's also concave in the size of the shock as well. So what we find here, for example, is that for firms that have annual or half-yearly price changes, they have significant pass-through to their prices, whereas the pass-through the IPT is not significant for firms that have quarterly or more frequent price changes. And we also find this concave result as well. As the shock becomes larger in size, the IPT goes down. A number of robustness checks that I won't have time for. So let me just kind of go on to the model now. in the last couple of minutes that I have. So the model overview is that we have a G model with sector-specific probabilities of non-adjustment, which we calibrate to the data. And to pin down this theoretical IPT, we consider a common shifter to future marginal costs of all firms, which last for a fixed number of periods. This is to match the tariff announcement, for example. And we introduce a second source of heterogeneity as well in the perceived horizons of the shifter. In particular, we say that firms in sector K believe that the shock will occur in DK periods. And we also match these perceived horizons also to the data. Okay, so we have that. And what we have, therefore, is kind of our main proposition that the IPT in this model is given by this formula here. So what are the characteristics of this formula? Very, very quickly. And that's, if we focus here on the left-hand side, hopefully you can see my mouse, you can see that the IPT is decreasing in the size in the shock horizon in DK. So as the shock is expected to occur further away in the future, IPT goes down. And IPT is increasing in the probability of non-adjustment. That's down here on the left. So firms that have kind of a lower frequency of adjustment, higher price duration, they have a higher IPT. That's exactly what we find in the data as well. Furthermore, what we find is that the IPT is convex in both of these parameters. So it's convex in the shock horizons, and it's also convex in the probabilities of non-adjustment. And what that means is that there's some kind of really nice implications for the implications for aggregate inflation. In particular, what we find is heterogeneity in the perceived horizons by a kind of a Jensen's inequality argument that's going to amplify the contemporaneous response of aggregate CPI to a common shift in expected future costs. And likewise, heterogeneity in the adjustment frequencies amplifies the contemporaneous response of CPI to a common shifter in expected future marginal costs. So heterogeneity matters and amplifies the forward-lookingness of aggregate inflation. That's kind of the key takeaway. And that's kind of what we find in this slide. The final thing to kind of show is that we also simulate solve the model under a fully nonlinear solution in order to try to replicate this result in the data on the nonlinearity of the shock, right? Where I showed that it's kind of concave in the size of the shock. And that's exactly what we find as well in the model. So for example, the red line here is a linear IPT, but what we find with the nonlinear model is that IPT is not linear at all. In fact, as the shock grows in size, IPT increases, but at some point starts to decrease. Again, in the limit, if you know you're going to have a huge shock a year from now, you're going to update your probability of adjusting prices in that period, and therefore IPT kind of goes towards zero. Okay, to conclude, we estimate intertemporal pass-through of future cost shocks using a large survey of UK firms in 2 quasi-natural experiments, a tariff announcement in 2019, and an announcement of an increase in payroll taxes in 2024. One was deflationary, one was inflationary. What we find is that IPT is increasing in price stickiness and decreasing in the expected horizons of the shock. There's also a nonlinearity as well, and a model that shows us that these heterogeneities are important when studying the aggregate implications for the aggregate forward-lookingness of inflation to future cost shocks. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you so much. All right, so we should move on to questions now. So we like to give an opportunity for the speakers to ask questions of each other. Maybe let's start with questions for Kelsey. I will kick us off, but this question comes from Dominic. Kelsey, have you looked into the role of sales in inflation dispersion? Is it possible that when inflation is high, firms have more incentive to raise prices, but also offer more temporary discounts, which increases dispersion?
So in the results that I showed you, I kind of applied a common price for every good based on what shows up in the realized transactions data. So people buying on sale, off sale, but when I allow for price heterogeneity, in separate estimates, the dispersion of inflation outcomes grows substantially. So what that, I think, tells me in response to this question is, yes, the like time variation of prices that people encountered kind of layers on top of this, very importantly, in a way that, yes, I think it contributes to the dynamics, but does not dampen them. That's what I'll say is the evidence I've looked at so far. But I've not specifically looked at count of frequency of sales, for instance, in the data.
So I had a kind of related question actually for you, which was, is some of this that you're seeing, this kind of increasing dispersion of price changes, is it because some of these price changes are lagging others? Like maybe Pete's has the price change first and then eventually Folgers catches up. Like if you were to do the same thing over a 3-year horizon, would you see kind of similar eventual price changes?
Great question. When I talk, I mentioned it only in passing, but what I call this like the persistence of the price shock, I think he gets at this very question. And the evidence seems to say that the other prices do not catch up quickly, if so, right? So it's not that, Folgers moved first, and the next quarter, everyone else also has finally internalized that 20% price increase. I think the most direct piece of evidence I have for this will show up in this year's Papers and Proceedings volume, where I look at a basket in 2019, and I kind of track that set of households and the prices that they're paying for their basket, their kind of annual average basket, as it evolves all the way through 2023. And the dispersion only continues to grow with time. So I think there's not enough mean reversion going on to draw households back to the center.
Okay. One more question, because you kind of mentioned this like idea that, when we have this high inflation, these are basically real cost shocks for the household, or kind of budget shocks, and that households respond to these by reducing their consumption. So one of the things that you mentioned is that, in our theory, if households expect more inflation, they should actually go and they should accelerate their purchases, right? Like you made this kind of intertemporal substitution argument. And I guess, can you clarify how you think about that with groceries, right? Because I'm not going to buy coffee now instead of if I anticipate inflation.
So what I'm describing as the evidence that I found is, picture one world where households kind of always show up and they always buy the same basket of goods, inattentive to what price they end up paying. In that world, they're never going to actually reduce their real consumption. They're just going to let the prices change their total grocery expenditures, right? What households actually do is let far less than the implied cost pass through to their expenditures. So what that tells me is that households are finding ways to reduce consumption. So maybe, even though I'm not switching my coffee brand, I am economizing elsewhere. I'm buying chicken instead of beef this week in order to keep my grocery budget fixed, despite the fact that the prices of many things in my basket have risen. So that's how I'm thinking of the way households reduce consumption in this world.
Okay. All right. Very good. Yvonne, Dominic, do you have any more questions for Kelsey? I want to make sure we can switch over. Okay, so let's move to questions for Yvonne then. So we have a question here. Is there any way for you to tell whether firms change their frequency of price adjustment in response to the marginal cost shock? Maybe some firms only update prices in January, but around these events, they update more often, in addition to changing the size of their price changes.
No, thanks very much for the question. I mean, we don't have like that high frequency data. When we ask the firms, for example, in the survey, we kind of ask them at particular periods about, for 2024 on average, rather than, having a time series on the frequency. But one thing I'll point out is kind of in the estimates, we're looking at kind of the non-zero, so conditional on kind of changing your price. We're estimating the IPT. So this is only for firms that are already kind of updating their prices in order to get as close as possible to the kind of the reset price idea in the theory.
Ivan, can I ask a question? One of your shocks is a labor cost shock, and the other one is a tariff shock. So it's going to be a materials cost, right? I think you did something in like the exposure to the labor cost shock and kind of how you actually constructed the size of the shock for other firms. But have you thought about going and kind of thinking about how these different shocks affect firms based on their labor intensity specifically? Like, is the effect of the labor cost shock much more significant among those firms or something like that?
Well, in some sense, we're kind of trying to capture
Right.
that in the construction of the shock, because, for example, firms that have, I think the biggest source of heterogeneity is, for example, are firms kind of high wage on average. Firms that are kind of low wage and are, for example, close to the minimum wage threshold. Those ones had a much higher shock on average, just because of the way the policy was implemented.
Right. Did you have two parts of your exposure weight there? Like you had some kind of labor share? Because you could imagine also kind of not making that a part of the exposure. You could just have the kind of where they fall in the wage distribution as the exposure.
Yeah, that's a good idea. So we can try that as well. I don't think we've tried that. We're trying to get, I think the idea was kind of to get as close to like a change in firms as variable costs
Sure.
in order to estimate it. But we can try to test for the heterogeneity as well by labor costs, for example.
I can jump in with a question
Yeah,
for
of course.
Kelsey if we'll allow a more IO focused question in this talk.
Of
But
course, yes.
yeah. So Kelsey, does your research tell us anything about like how retailers are setting prices, or whether they're like in these areas of times of high inflation, like anything about greedflation, or like if consumers aren't substituting, or if they're not being very attentive to these price changes, should retailers behave differently?
I think that's really one of the main questions of interest that came to my mind with the price change dispersion facts. I don't have an answer to that question. I think it, there's a consistent, tell of the facts is that these firms face very different cost shocks. I loved Ivan's presentation for updating my thinking on, the heterogeneity of price changes that might evolve even among different firms for their forecasts of the same cost shock. So it's consistent with that hypothesis. It's consistent with a world where instead you think households might be inattentive to distinguishing relative versus average price changes in this period, and different firms exploit that differently, right? I can't distinguish, or I don't try to distinguish in the paper, but very interesting question. I will say just about the phrasing, I'm not necessarily taking a retailer specific perspective, right? I can think of kind of the producers of these goods as setting prices kind of in common across retailers, and that flowing downstream is a different model for how I was thinking through it. But lastly, I'll just mention there is some evidence that prices are changing more at the bottom of the quality distribution than above it. So that's the one kind of fact that I do know about the question of which goods have their prices changing. Households buying the generics are more badly hit than households kind of up the chain.
Okay. Well, let me finish this out by asking Ivan a kind of thematically similar question, which is, you have these kind of expectations and kind of the frequency of the firm's own price change. Do you think that there's do you have any way of looking at the strategic element of the firm's price change, right? That they have their own marginal costs that they're anticipating, but they also have their competitors who may have the same marginal cost shock or may have different marginal cost shocks, and they also have to kind of compete on their price change as well.
I mean, I think we've tried in the past looking at some of these heterogeneities as well. I mean, we had some survey responses on like the importance of competitors' prices, but ultimately, I don't think those were kind of really significant in our results. I think one thing that was significant, I didn't have time for today, but we do have some questions on how firms change prices, whether they're kind of more time dependent in their price changes, kind of changing prices at like fixed intervals, or whether they're more kind of state dependent, changing prices in response to costs and demand. And over there, we find that firms that are kind of state dependent have a lower intertemporal pass through of these expected cost shocks. So that's one result that's kind of that stands out.
Very cool. All right, it is 11:45. Thank you both so much. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.